Hey there, I see you're enjoying our commentary section. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you. Grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into a new story. Looking back, I realized that my childhood was shaped by the unchanging rhythm of our neighborhood. The narrow streets, the corner stores, the familiar faces, all of it formed the backdrop of my earliest memories. My father's routine of heading off to work before sunrise, my mother's watchful presence at home, and the way the neighborhood kids all knew each other by name. These were the constants of my world. It was a place where loyalty was expected, and everyone's business was public knowledge. You didn't just live in the neighborhood, you were a part of its fabric. I'm Ethan Matthews, the oldest of two, raised in South Philadelphia. My dad worked as a postal driver, and my mom stayed home. At 12, we moved into a small row house typical for the area. My world back then was just one block, but when I visit now, I can't help but notice how many trees have been replaced by gray concrete. My grandmother lived nearby, and my great-grandmother's house was just a few blocks away. In our tight-knit neighborhood, families didn't move much. I was an awkward, shy kid, tall and lanky, making me an easy target for bullies. In my old neighborhood, I fought to find my place, but now I was starting over. Tank, a stocky, confident kid, was my main rival. One day, on my way home from the store, he shoved me and knocked my bag out of my hands. I could hear something inside break, and I knew my mom would be mad. Without thinking, I punched him in the eye, sending him to the ground. His friends pulled him away, but I knew there'd be a rematch. A week later, Tank and his crew ambushed me. Just as things were about to get ugly, two boys from the local Catholic school intervened. They fought off the bullies with impressive skill. These two, Nathan and David, became my closest friends. David was outgoing and charismatic, a natural leader, while Nathan was quieter, always observing and making sure we stayed out of trouble. Nathan, an only child, bonded with us quickly, and the three of us became like brothers. David had a younger sister, and I had a sister just 2 years younger, though she often acted like the older one. David's father had recently died in a fire, which left him shaken. We spent a lot of time at his house, reading comics, baseball cards, and later books, encouraged by David's mom, an English teacher. During summer, we played baseball every day at a sandlot behind our street. Nathan got permission from the lot's owners, and David organized the games. I wasn't the best player, but I was always picked when David was captain. We were inseparable, and our bond grew even stronger as we got older. The following summer, Miguel Vega, the only Puerto Rican kid in the neighborhood, joined us. Despite some adult gossip about his family, his love for baseball helped him fit in. He later developed a crush on my sister Paula and eventually married her, but at the time we just focused on the game. David and Nathan's outgoing personalities helped me break out of my shell. They helped me meet new people, and looking back, most of my friendships were through them. By 18, we were all focused on getting into college. We had good grades and set our sights on the University of Pennsylvania. After years of studying together, our SAT scores were all in the high 1400s. Miguel had different plans, aiming to join the military, and eventually became a Marine officer. When we got into Penn, our parents were ecstatic. No one expected kids from our neighborhood to make it to an Ivy League school, and we quickly became local celebrities. The timing was perfect, as the university was looking to recruit more local students, and we benefited from the shift. Though we received some scholarships, we still faced heavy debt. In August 1978, we moved into a two-bedroom suite in a new dorm. David took the smaller room, and Nathan and I shared the larger one. It was my first time living outside the neighborhood, and the campus felt massive. Without my friends, I would have struggled to adjust. David became a social magnet, knowing everyone on campus, while Nathan focused on meeting women, especially wealthy ones who paid for his outings. I wondered how he managed, but David later explained that Nathan had a charm that always made things work. Nathan's double-date setups helped me meet women, and what started as an awkward transition to college life turned into an exciting adventure with my two best friends. By the second month of my freshman year, I was going out 2 to 3 times a week, constantly dating or planning dates. It became all-consuming, and my grades dropped. By semester's end, the associate dean warned me my scholarship was at risk. That was my wake-up call. During Christmas break, I stopped dating and focused on my academics. Though I missed the company of the women, none of them were serious relationships, and I needed to refocus. Nathan had to find a new double-date partner, and David reluctantly agreed to step in. Through this, David ended up dating Diane. Nathan had been pursuing her for weeks, but she wasn't interested in him romantically. She set up a double date, and by the end of the night, Nathan had found his distraction in Sonia, a beautiful part-time model, and Diane was drawn to David. Over the next few weeks, Diane became a regular presence at our apartment, and her connection with David was undeniable. Diane came from a wealthy suburban Quaker family. She was an only child, used to luxury, with a wardrobe picked out by a consultant and a car on campus. Her life had been centered around travel and privilege, but she knew little about Philadelphia beyond the campus. I struggled to connect with her. She represented everything I resented about privilege. She was polite but distant, and I returned the sentiment. David reassured me of her good qualities, but I kept my distance. Meanwhile, my love life was stagnant. With David and Nathan focused on their relationships, I felt left out. That's when I met Denise. She worked at a local deli, and after weeks of casual flirting, I finally asked her out. Denise was 18, with curly brown hair and a petite, athletic build. Nathan took an interest in her, and that pushed me to act. The university was hosting a track and field event, and after Nathan mentioned he was interested in Denise, I claimed her as off-limits. That night, I asked her out. We went to a rooftop party, danced, and ended up talking in a quiet spot, where we shared a long, passionate kiss. It was the most intense kiss I'd ever experienced. Eventually, we went back to my apartment. What followed was a whirlwind of nervous excitement as we undressed and shared an intimate moment. During the night, she mentioned she wasn't a maiden, and though I barely processed her words, the intimacy overwhelmed me. Afterward, we lay together, exchanging slow kisses, until she whispered something about having my children. That word, children, made everything stop. I hadn't used protection. Panic gripped me. What if she got pregnant? What would I do? I barely knew her, had never been to her house. The realization hit me like a freight train. The next morning she left, mentioning she had told her mom she was staying with a friend. I pretended to be half asleep, but once she was gone, panic took over. Later, when she returned wearing a Catholic school uniform, I realized she was still in high school. I panicked. I didn't want anything to do with her and asked Nathan and David to cover for me. Nathan found it hilarious, but David was uncomfortable and didn't understand why I was avoiding her. He reluctantly agreed to help, but was uneasy about it. I felt terrible about ghosting her, but was too much of a coward to face the situation. What would I even say? That I'd gotten carried away? That I enjoyed our time but didn't want a relationship? The truth was, I wanted a relationship, but not like this. In the end, I never saw Denise again. Weeks later, I wrote her a letter apologizing and asking for forgiveness. It was pathetic, but I needed to acknowledge what I had done. The experience left me ashamed. I had hurt someone because I was too consumed by my own desires. I vowed never to let that happen again. I buried myself in my studies, closing out my sophomore year with a 3.4 GPA. Determined to achieve a perfect 4.0 comma, I planned to avoid all distractions. By then, we had been living in the same apartment for 2 years, but at the end of sophomore year, Nathan somehow negotiated a move to another suite in the building. The new apartment had larger bedrooms, though I still ended up sharing a room with him. It didn't matter. I was focused on my academics and little else. 8 months later, in March of 1981, I finally emerged from my self-imposed isolation. One early morning, as I stepped into the hallway half asleep, I saw a woman in a robe heading into our bathroom. She wasn't Diane. She was taller, curvier. More importantly, she had come from David's room. I immediately went back to wake Nathan. "Has David split with Diane?" I whispered. Nathan, groggy but amused, explained that the woman was Rachel, Diane's best friend. She had moved in temporarily due to roommate issues. David, who was practically living at Diane's place, had offered his room. I was annoyed. No one had asked me if I was okay sharing my space with a stranger. Later that morning, I officially met Rachel. She was tall, with long legs, light brown skin, and thick curly hair draped over her shoulders. Even seated, I could tell she had a striking, full figure. Not overweight, just lush in a way that commanded attention. But what caught me most were her large, dark eyes framed by bold eyebrows. Nathan introduced us, but I ruined the moment by asking, in a less than friendly tone, how long she planned to stay. Clearly offended, she answered curtly, saying she hoped it wouldn't be long and that she didn't want to be anywhere she wasn't welcome. Nathan quickly changed the subject, but Rachel had already dismissed me. She turned her attention solely to him, making it clear I was not someone she wanted to engage with. I walked away, frustrated by her reaction. Back in my room, I replayed our exchange and realized the issue wasn't Rachel. It was me. I had been rude, making it obvious I wanted her gone. But my problem wasn't just with her. Ever since Denise, I had built a wall around myself, avoiding emotional connections with women. It was my way of punishing myself for how I had treated her. Determined to fix my first impression, I made an effort to be more welcoming. Rachel had planned to stay for just a few days, but those days turned into 7 weeks. By the time she left, she had practically become our third roommate. She added fresh flowers to our dining table, rearranged the furniture to make the space more inviting, and brought a level of organization we had never considered. Though I had initially resented her presence, I eventually realized that Rachel Montoya had been exactly the kind of energy our apartment needed. Rachel's energy and enthusiasm naturally drew people in. And without realizing it, Nathan and I started following her lead. We weren't messy by our own standards, but clothes often ended up in random places, and dishes sometimes piled up in the sink. Once she settled in, that changed. Without a word, she made it clear that leaving things undone was not an option. We instinctively adjusted, wanting to keep her happy. Her influence wasn't just about tidiness. Rachel loved to cook, and when she asked if she could prepare meals for us, it was impossible to refuse. She seemed especially conscious of my initial resistance to her staying, looking at me as she posed the question. Nathan and I quickly agreed, unaware that this decision would completely transform our apartment. She was an incredible cook. The delicious smells floating through our door soon attracted attention, and before long, neighbors started reintroducing themselves just to drop hints about dinner. What began as casual visits for a good meal turned into regular gatherings. But it wasn't just about the food. Rachel was engaging, sharp, and could hold a conversation on almost any topic. From anthropology to horror films, local politics to food marketing, she spoke with confidence and curiosity. The guys flirted with her constantly, but she never seemed affected by it. If there was one topic that made her eyes light up, though, it was baseball. I discovered this by accident one afternoon when I was venting about the Phillies pitching. To my surprise, she chimed in from her bedroom, agreeing with me. That moment sparked a long conversation, our first real one-on-one interaction after 3 weeks of her staying with us. We sat together for hours, debating strategies and reliving the World Series. Rachel had been there for Game 7, just like I had, screaming herself hoarse as the Phillies won their first championship in nearly a century. Her passion for the game floored me. As we talked, she would touch my arm or hand to emphasize a point, small gestures, but enough to make my pulse quicken. Up until that point, our interactions had been limited to preparing meals or doing dishes in relative silence. But now, I was seeing her in a new light, and I liked what I saw. Beyond her lively conversations, Rachel had a kindness that stood out. She always stopped to help the homeless on campus, no matter who was watching. Some people found it awkward, but I admired her for it. Still, despite my growing interest in her, it was Nathan who spent most of his time with her. If we were competing for her attention, he was winning. Part of me was relieved. The other part was jealous, though I had no right to be. One night, after a long shift at the library, I stopped at a bar, hoping a few drinks would take my mind off her. By the time I stumbled into the apartment after 2 a.m., I was tipsy and exhausted. Trying not to wake Rachel, I removed my shoes and quietly made my way to my room. Halfway down the hall, I heard muffled sounds from her room. Voices, movement. I froze. It took me a second to register what I was hearing. It was Nathan. The realization hit me like a gut punch. The low murmurs and moans left little room for doubt. I couldn't listen to this. Grabbing a pillow and a blanket, I slipped out of the apartment and crashed on a couch in the rooftop lounge, trying to ignore the twisting in my stomach. By morning, Rachel was gone. Not just out of the apartment. She had moved out entirely. Her room was empty, her belongings packed up without a trace. Even the kitchen was different. Her pots, utensils, everything she had brought with her had disappeared. When I asked Nathan about it, he gave vague answers, acting like he had no idea where she had gone. His lack of interest was unsettling. A few days later, David stopped by and immediately asked about Rachel. He seemed to think I had something to do with her sudden departure. Diane, his girlfriend, had hinted that I had driven Rachel away. That couldn't have been further from the truth. If anything, I missed her, but I had no right to ask where she had gone. She had been with Nathan, not me. By late April, no one mentioned Rachel anymore. It was as if she had never been there. Nathan suggested she left due to some falling out with Diane, similar to the conflict that had caused her to leave her previous apartment. That explanation seemed plausible, but I wasn't entirely convinced. Still, I let it go. Life moved on. By late May, David dropped by for one of his increasingly rare visits. Over beers and a Phillies game, he finally admitted what had been on his mind. He was going to propose to Diane. I laughed, asking when she had told him to buy the ring. He pretended to be annoyed, but then admitted she had hinted at not wanting to wait until after law school. He didn't mind. He loved her, and that was all that mattered. Then came the unexpected part. He wanted me to be his best man. I was honored, but also surprised. Nathan had been his friend longer, and had known Diane longer too, but David insisted. While Diane had suggested Nathan, David made it clear this was his decision. Nathan, to his credit, was fine with it. Diane, however, was not. The wedding was set for June of the following year, a few weeks after graduation, leaving plenty of time for her to change her mind. As senior year began, I threw myself into my studies, determined to graduate without distractions. By June 1982, we had reached the finish line. David was heading to law school, I had secured a job at a tech consulting firm, and Nathan was starting a career in pharmaceutical sales. Despite everything, we would all be staying in the city. Rachel was gone, but her presence still lingered in my thoughts. Whatever had made her leave, I never found out. And maybe deep down, I didn't want to. Here's the fully rewritten, condensed version with improved clarity and structure. Planning. David and Diane's wedding turned out to be far more challenging than I had expected. With her parents divorced, Diane initially refused to invite her father. After months of tension, she finally agreed, on the condition that he would walk her down the aisle. David negotiated the arrangement, and I was given the task of speaking with her father. Though I had considered bringing Nathan along, I ultimately went alone. It was clear the moment I stepped into his office that I wasn't his kind of person. But I spoke on Diane's behalf with confidence, and in exchange for his role in the ceremony, he agreed to buy the couple a home in Swarthmore as a wedding gift. Even with this uneasy truce, the wedding day was tense. The reception felt like navigating a minefield, as Diane's father's side of the family made their resentment clear. Twice, I was cornered by angry relatives looking to argue. By the end of the night, I was relieved to see David and Diane off on their honeymoon. If I ever got married, I swore it wouldn't be like this. With the wedding behind me, I focused on my career and adjusting to life on my own. I had moved into an apartment in University City and was in the process of furnishing it when, one evening, I got an unexpected call from Diane. She wanted to thank me for my help with the wedding, but more than that, she wanted to apologize. She admitted that she had intentionally kept her distance from me, believing I had driven Rachel away just as I had done with Denise. Hearing her say it stung. I assured her I'd never wanted Rachel to leave. My voice nearly cracked as I said it. Diane explained that David had set the record straight, helping her understand just how close he and I were. It had hurt him that she and I didn't get along, and now she regretted misjudging me. She asked if we could start over. I agreed, relieved that the tension between us was finally lifting. From there, our conversation became surprisingly natural. We talked like old friends. I discovered she had a sharp sense of humor, something I had never noticed before. A few days later, she called again, this time offering to help me decorate my apartment. So it has at least some feminine touch, she teased. And you don't scare off potential girlfriends. For the next few months, Saturdays became our shopping days. Given her workload, balancing 2 jobs while supporting David in law school, I had no idea how she found the time. But I welcomed the company. Despite my initial assumptions, Diane wasn't a snob. She was down-to-earth, thoughtful, and incredibly kind. Through our conversations, I learned more about her family. Her father, rather than being a caring provider, had always lavished her with gifts, hiring designers for her apartment, choosing and delivering cars she hadn't asked for. She had tolerated it until his affair led to her parents' divorce. That betrayal changed everything. She distanced herself from him and became fiercely independent. Her father's infidelity left a lasting impact, making her question even her closest relationships. Though she never said it outright, I sensed that deep down, she sometimes doubted David's love for her. If they had a minor disagreement, she would confide in me rather than burden him with her insecurities. At first, I encouraged her to talk to him directly, but over time, I realized she didn't need advice, just someone to listen. Not long after Diane and I reconciled, David introduced a tradition that remains to this day, monthly poker nights at their house. The core group was David, Nathan, and me, with Miguel joining whenever he was in town. A rotating 5th player filled the last seat. These nights became the glue that kept us connected. 3 years passed, and life was steady. I was thriving at work, respected by my peers, and on track for management. The only thing missing was a serious relationship. Then, in May 1985, things took a turn. David was graduating from law school, and one warm Sunday afternoon, we sat on his patio debating whether to fire up the grill. He seemed preoccupied. When I asked about Diane, he admitted she was at her mother's, still upset with him. He had received a job offer in Chicago, an opportunity too good to ignore. The firm was flying him out for an interview and to tour potential neighborhoods. The problem? He had agreed to the meeting without discussing it with Diane first. David explained that no matter how much he reassured her, she still harbored a fear that he might leave. The job interview had intensified those doubts. I knew exactly what he meant. Diane's insecurities had been there since the beginning, amplified by the statistics they shared at law school orientation. 3 out of 4 marriages wouldn't survive until graduation. That had deeply unsettled her. David leaned back, his jaw tight. I'm not like that, Ethan. She's my partner. She worked 2 jobs for years without complaint. She managed everything, our money, my books, food, everything. Now, I finally have a chance to take care of her. I thought she'd be excited. You need to fix this, I said. He raised an eyebrow. And how do you suggest I do that? I grinned. 3 simple words. David sat up, intrigued. Yeah? I was wrong, he burst out laughing. The tension lifted and the conversation shifted back to baseball and barbecue plans. The next night, I found myself working late at the office. By the time I remembered my coworker's bachelor party downtown, it was already 9:30. I wasn't particularly eager to go, but I had known Ted for years, and skipping wasn't an option. The party was being held at a new club on the pier. I arrived late and had to park in the side lot. The venue had 2 floors, an open bar and restaurant below, and a private event space upstairs. As I made my way to the staircase, I glanced inside the restaurant. The sleek modern decor caught my eye, but the dim lighting left the space feeling cold and uninviting. Maybe that explained why it was nearly empty. I paused for a moment, debating whether to go inside. It was just another night, just another party. Or so I thought. I had no idea that trouble was waiting for me upstairs. As I entered the club, I noticed Nathan and Diane in a booth across the room, engaged in what seemed like an intense conversation. Diane's posture was slouched, and she looked unsteady. I considered stopping by, but decided against it, figuring I'd see them later. Upstairs, the bachelor party was in full swing, filled with laughter, drinks, and over-the-top entertainment. A couple of hours later, I went downstairs to use the restroom, remembering that Diane and Nathan had been there earlier. Their booth was now empty. After finishing in the bathroom, a faint noise caught my attention, a muffled moan from one of the stalls. Instinct told me to walk away, but something kept me there. I pushed the stall door open and found Diane inside. She was slumped against the wall, her dress bunched around her waist, pantyhose torn. There were bruises on her shoulder and chest, and the air reeked of something foul. She looked dazed and disoriented, clearly in distress. The signs of a struggle were undeniable. Nathan was nowhere to be found. She barely registered my presence, struggling to focus. Though she needed medical attention, she clung to my arm, begging me not to call anyone. Reluctantly, I helped her out of the club unnoticed, got her into my car, and drove her home in silence. She barely spoke, only mentioning that she had taken the train into town and that Nathan had driven them to the club. Arriving at her house after 1 a.m., I expected David to answer the door, but the house was empty. He was in Chicago. I let Diane inside, where she finally broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Sitting beside her, I offered quiet support as she cried herself to sleep. Exhausted, I eventually drifted off as well. By morning, Diane seemed steadier but still shaken. After a shower, she returned to the kitchen, her expression tense but composed. Over coffee, I asked what had happened. She explained that after David left for Chicago, she had called Nathan out of frustration, needing to talk. She had also left me a message, but hearing no response, turned to Nathan for support. He sympathized, agreeing that David was being selfish and even suggesting he might have ulterior motives for moving. Already upset, she drank the wine Nathan gave her. Her thoughts blurred, and she lost track of time. He suggested getting food, and they ended up at the restaurant. From there, her memories fractured. She recalled feeling too drowsy to stay awake. At some point, she found herself in the restroom, barely conscious, with Nathan's hands on her. The realization of what had happened hit her hard. He had taken advantage of her in her most vulnerable state. Tears streamed down her face as she questioned why he had done this, how someone she had trusted could betray her so completely. A wave of anger burned through me. She sensed it, tightening her grip on my arm, as if afraid of what I might do next. Nathan had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. Nathan's betrayal was beyond anything I had ever experienced. Rage consumed me, and if he had walked into the room at that moment, I would have liquidated him with my bare hands. My body trembled, but Diane's voice pulled me back. She insisted they go to the police, but I refused. She then argued that David needed to know, warning that if I didn't tell him, she would. I pushed back, knowing this would destroy him, but she wouldn't back down. Then she dropped another bomb. She was pregnant. The fear in her voice made it clear she was risking everything. I had no choice but to agree to her terms. She made me promise not to hurt Nathan, reminding me how dangerous my anger could be. It was clear she now saw me as her protector, a role I had never expected to take on. The next morning, David called from Chicago, unaware of everything that had happened. Diane kept up a flawless act over the phone, but I could see the strain on her face. He mentioned that the job offer wasn't what he had expected, making her realize that her desperate meeting with Nathan had been for nothing. Still, she was firm. David couldn't know. I knew we couldn't keep this secret forever. The longer we waited, the worse it would get. But telling David would mean exposing everything, including my role in covering it up. Meanwhile, Nathan remained a threat. His attack on Diane made it clear he wasn't just a man who made a mistake. He was a predator. If we didn't stop him, he would do it again. Reporting him to the police now would be pointless. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence, and any legal case could quickly turn into a civil lawsuit that could ruin us all. If we told David, his reaction would be violent, and I couldn't blame him. But we had no plan, no way to stop Nathan that wouldn't end in disaster. I considered tracking him, digging into his life, searching for anything that could expose him. But what evidence would I even find? This wasn't a crime show where criminals left behind convenient clues. Breaking into his place wasn't an option, and following him wasn't realistic. One thing was clear. Diane wasn't safe. If Nathan had the audacity to attack her in a public place, he might try again. And if not her, someone else close to us could be next. Miguel was the only person I trusted, so I told him everything. He immediately saw the danger, particularly for my sister Paula. Though married now, she had always been friendly with Nathan. We agreed, if Nathan ever made a move toward her, Miguel would deal with him, and I would provide his alibi. But Diane remained the primary target. Nathan had likely expected her to keep quiet, challenging her to do something about it. If he struck again, it would be when she was alone, probably at home while David was away. I couldn't let that happen. I told Diane I would stay with her whenever David was out of town. She agreed, knowing my silence with David was leverage. Miguel insisted on training me, not in self-defense, but in how to liquidate. At first I resisted, but over time I accepted his logic. If Nathan ever tried again, he wouldn't walk away. The months of training were brutal. I had no experience, and my skills were non-existent. But eventually, I learned enough to be certain. I could take Nathan in a fight, and if it came to it, I could end him. As time passed, the urgency to tell David faded. Diane and I avoided the conversation entirely. When David finally left for a trip, she called days in advance, knowing I would be at her house the moment he was gone. I checked every window, every door, noting vulnerabilities. Soon after, a security system was installed, and surveillance cameras covered every major entrance. Diane told David it was for peace of mind with the baby on the way. He didn't question it. When their daughter Clara was born, David stayed home more, and my concerns eased. Maybe I'd overestimated Nathan's threat, but when Clara was 3 months old, that illusion was shattered. David had a 2-day trip to Atlanta, and Diane called as usual to let me know. I was already on my way when my car phone rang. Her voice was tense. Nathan had just pulled up in front of her house. I was seconds away. She just needed to hold him off until I got there. The moment I set the phone down, my entire mindset shifted. Every muscle tensed as I prepared for a possible confrontation. My training took over. I ran through every move I had drilled for months, ready to take Nathan down if necessary. Pulling up beside his car, I found him standing on the landing, dressed like he was making a sales call. His hands were empty, his demeanor casual. We greeted each other as if nothing was wrong and waited for Diane. She played her part, but I could see the tension in her movements. Nathan gave some vague reason for his visit, but Diane and I had already rehearsed our cover story. I was there to fix their computer after a virus scare. We stuck to it flawlessly. If he suspected anything, he didn't show it. After about 30 minutes, he left. The second the door closed, Diane broke down, nearly hysterical. The close call reignited my paranoia. I vowed never to be caught off guard again. I resumed training with Miguel, refining my hand-to-hand combat. I bought a tool and became proficient at the firing range. I was prepared for the next time. That was the only time Nathan showed up at Diane's while we were alone, but I still saw him at poker nights, parties, and gatherings. I forced myself to act normal, though the effort was exhausting. He eventually noticed, commenting on how quiet I had become. I used that to my advantage, listening more carefully, analyzing his words for any slip-ups. Occasionally, paranoia got the better of me, and I tailed him for a day or two, but it led to nothing. The secrecy wore on me. Diane and I had been trapped in this agreement for nearly 3 years. The longer we kept the truth from David, the more impossible it became to tell him. We were waiting, either for an opportunity or for something beyond our control to force our hand. That moment arrived unexpectedly. Miguel had suggested I spend the weekend with my 6-year-old nephew, Carlos, giving my sister and brother-in-law a long overdue break. Miguel hoped it would help me unwind. Parenting, even temporarily, had a way of grounding people, forcing them to focus on something real. By mid-morning, Carlos was hungry, and I realized my kitchen had nothing remotely suitable for a child. We set off on foot to the grocery store, my real plan being to wear him out before his afternoon nap. The walk, however, turned into a series of distractions. 6-year-olds didn't just walk, they explored, questioned, and touched everything. By the time we reached the store, I was mentally exhausted. Carlos, on the other hand, was energized, racing through the aisles, picking out his favorites. I stepped into autopilot mode, relieved to be stationary as we waited in the checkout line. Then I saw her. The cashier looked familiar, though I couldn't place her at first. Her hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, her face fuller than I remembered, with subtle lines of worry creasing her forehead. Her expression was serious, focused on her work. But even in a simple store uniform, her beauty was undeniable. Recognition hit me suddenly. It was Rachel. 7 years had passed since I had last seen her. Memories surfaced, but they weren't warm ones. We had been polite, but not particularly close. I debated pretending I didn't recognize her, hoping to avoid an awkward encounter. Carlos made that impossible. As soon as he reached for a pack of cookies, Rachel's gaze followed, and she broke into a warm smile. The ice was broken before I had a chance to escape. She recognized me immediately, greeting me with a friendly warmth I hadn't expected. We exchanged small talk. Carlos introduced himself, and Rachel mentioned she had a daughter his age. The conversation was short, but surprisingly pleasant. Then, just before I left, she asked about Diane and David. When I told her they were still together and living in Swarthmore, she nodded, but said nothing more. That night, after Carlos was asleep, I called Diane. The moment she answered, I knew she was caught off guard. When I mentioned Rachel's name, her tone shifted. It had been 7 years since they last spoke. Rachel had disappeared suddenly, leaving no goodbye, no explanation. Diane had tried reaching out, even calling Rachel's parents, but they had been just as confused. It was as if she had vanished on purpose. Hearing about Rachel again stirred something in Diane. She was eager to reconnect, asking which store she worked at and if I had gotten a phone number. I hadn't, but I mentioned Rachel was using her maiden name and had a 6-year-old daughter. The news seemed to take Diane by surprise. After a brief pause, she said she needed to call her immediately. I didn't know why, but something about Rachel's sudden reappearance felt important, like a loose thread in a story we had long abandoned, one that might finally unravel the truth. The evening had been pleasant, filled with good food and casual conversation. Diane's mother, along with David's mom and stepfather, had joined us, taking turns doting on Clara, while David and I slipped away to watch the Eagles dominate the Cowboys. Settled into his recliner, David was at ease, until he brought up Rachel. He asked if I planned to see her again, implying it wasn't just a casual run-in. Diane had already spoken with Rachel, and from the way he smirked, it was clear she had been playing matchmaker. He assured me Rachel wasn't seeing anyone, which seemed to amuse him even more. I found the idea absurd. After 7 years apart, Diane had apparently decided Rachel and I were meant to be. But then David turned serious, asking if I was prepared for the reality of dating a single mother. His own experience shaped his concern. After his father's death, he had been the man of the house, his mother's first line of defense against unworthy suitors. Now he viewed Rachel through that same protective lens. I assured him I wasn't looking for something fleeting, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure what I really wanted. A few weeks later, I found myself back at Rachel's store. Ignoring an open express lane, I deliberately entered her line. She smiled the moment she saw me, confirming my instincts. I asked for her number, and she handed me my receipt with it scribbled on the back. That night, we spoke for the first time outside the store. The conversation was light but engaging. We talked about her job, her favorite foods, the upcoming baseball season, and of course, the Phillies. She admitted she didn't go out much, focusing on her daughter and work. There had been no serious relationships in years. I hadn't asked, yet she told me anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, we spoke constantly. If I didn't call, she did. We shared common tastes, similar values, and a growing ease in our conversations. Old memories resurfaced, making me regret not getting to know her better when we had lived together years ago. But more than that, I began questioning my feelings. Was this love? Infatuation? Did it even matter? I needed more time with her to figure it out. Then, before I could take the next step with Rachel, I got the call from Diane. David was out of town again, which meant another night at their house. By now, we had fallen into a routine. David would leave, and I would arrive within minutes. I parked down the road, waiting for his car to disappear before calling Diane to confirm she was alone. There had been a few awkward encounters when others had unexpectedly stopped by, and I had since learned to check. This secrecy had become second nature, but with each visit, it felt heavier. We were lying to David, and though we never spoke about it directly, we both knew the longer we waited, the worse the truth would be. I arrived at Diane's and went through my usual security sweep, checking locks, cameras, and making sure everything was secure before settling into the den. Diane soon appeared, carrying a cordless phone. Without a word, she handed it to me. Rachel was on the other end. She knew where I was. Diane had told her everything. Rachel and her daughter, Sophie, were on their way over. She insisted we needed to talk. I told her it could wait, that bringing a child out so late wasn't necessary, but she wouldn't hear it. She was coming. I turned to Diane for an explanation, but she was already heading upstairs, saying Rachel would explain. Tears were in her eyes. In all the years since her attack, I had only seen her cry that first night. That alone told me something was terribly wrong. 40 minutes later, Rachel arrived. I watched the surveillance feed as she stepped onto the porch, carrying a sleeping Sophie. She looked exhausted, but determined. After settling Sophie in the guest room, Rachel joined me in the den. I didn't need to ask what was wrong. I already knew. I asked if Nathan knew. Her body tensed before she quietly said no. She had no intention of telling him, at least not yet. Then, after a long pause, she admitted that Diane had asked her a question earlier that evening, whether Nathan had attacked her. The shock in her voice made it clear. Diane had guessed the truth before Rachel had even spoken a word. Rachel had kept the secret for years, telling no one out of fear. But hearing what had happened to Diane, knowing I had been the one to find her, changed everything. That was why she had come, because she could no longer keep it to herself. Now, Rachel and I both carried the same burden. Knowing Nathan had hurt her too confirmed my worst fears. He was a predator, and if there were two victims, there were likely more. I had been in denial about the extent of his depravity, but reality was forcing me to see the truth. Rachel, however, had more to say. She confessed she had intended to tell me about Sophie soon, but after learning what Diane and I had been doing, she knew she had to tell me now. I barely had time to process her words before she pulled me into a tight embrace. She trembled against me, and when she looked up, her eyes filled with tears. Then she kissed me. The first was hesitant, testing the waters. The second was deep and filled with longing, leaving no doubt. Rachel had feelings for me too. We stayed wrapped in each other's arms until she drifted off to sleep against my shoulder. My mind raced with questions. How would I protect her? How could we navigate this together? I had no answers, only the certainty that I wasn't letting her go. The next morning, Diane and the girls found us curled up on the couch. I had been nervous about meeting Sophie, but I quickly realized I had nothing to worry about. She was sweet, thoughtful, and instantly comfortable with me. Watching her interact with Clara, I saw reflections of Rachel in her kindness and patience. It deepened my admiration for the woman I was beginning to love. Diane and Rachel bonded in a way they never had before. There was a shared understanding between them, forged through pain, but anchored in hope. For Rachel, it felt like she was finally free from hiding. We stayed at Diane's until David returned, and when he saw Rachel, he welcomed her back as if she had never been gone. That evening, Rachel invited me to her place for dinner. The food was better than I remembered, and from that night on, I found myself at her apartment every evening. We ate together, spent time with Sophie, then stayed up talking long after she went to bed. Most nights ended with us tangled on the couch, lost in each other. But we were careful. Sophie was just down the hall. One evening, Rachel suggested we take a day off together while Sophie was at school. I agreed without hesitation. The next morning, when I arrived, she greeted me with a kiss that left my head spinning. The room was dimly lit, candles flickering, soft jazz playing. Wine, fruit, and cheese sat waiting on the table. But before I could take it all in, she pulled me toward her bedroom. There was no hesitation between us now. Rachel stood before me, her confidence magnetic, her presence overwhelming. She had always been beautiful, but seeing her like this, fully open to me, was something else entirely. We moved in sync, every touch filled with unspoken understanding. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something inevitable. By the time we finally left the bedroom, the sun was setting. That day marked the start of something permanent. The next morning, I returned to work feeling lighter, more at peace than I had in years. But my next task had nothing to do with work. After my last meeting, I waited outside a building, watching as people trickled out. My focus was on one man, Nathan. He was alone, which was exactly what I wanted. I caught up to him just as he reached the corner. When I called his name, he turned, grinning, making a joke about our poker game that night. I played along, but as I stepped closer, my tone changed. I mentioned Diane, then Rachel, then Sophie. His face faltered. His eyes blinked rapidly as he processed my words. I had my answer before he even spoke. We sat on a park bench and I let him talk. I didn't record him, I didn't need to. He filled in the missing pieces, telling me everything. For nearly an hour, he confessed, not realizing that with every word he sealed his fate. The next day at work, I felt different, stronger. I gave a speech in a staff meeting, something I never did, passionately defending our budget proposal. My colleagues were stunned at my confidence, congratulating me when we won approval. It was the first time in years I felt truly in control. That night, I arrived early for our poker game. Diane greeted me warmly, her pregnancy giving her a glow I had never seen before. She and David were building a family, filling their home with love. Watching them, I saw a future I had never dared to hope for. I took my seat at the poker table, feeling lucky for the first time in a long time. The poker game had started as usual, with laughter, drinks, and conversation. Miguel was home for an extended training assignment. David was debating baby names with Diane, convinced it would be a boy, and John was sharing stories about his latest date. As we played, Nathan's absence became more noticeable. By 8:30 p.m., it was clear he wasn't coming. David joked that he was probably with a woman and that we'd get his money next time. I was on a winning streak, steadily wiping out John and Miguel while depleting David's funds. But the mood shifted abruptly when Diane rushed into the room, visibly shaken. Before anyone could ask, she announced the news. Nathan was dead. Silence filled the room before David finally spoke, echoing what we were all thinking. What? Diane explained he had been found in his bathtub with his wrist slit, dead for at least a day. While the others reeled from the shock, only one thought entered my mind. The nightmare was over. 2 days later, I received a letter from Nathan, postmarked the day he died. I tossed it aside, not ready to deal with whatever final words he had left behind. Nearly a week passed before I finally opened it. Inside, he confessed to everything, detailing every attack, listing names, dates, and places. 5 victims, all women he had known. Rachel and Diane were there, but so were 3 others, all before Diane. The level of detail was disturbing. He had preyed on their trust, manipulating their sense of security. He justified it with a vague childhood trauma, but offered no real remorse, except for fathering Rachel's child. A wave of guilt hit me. Had we gone to the police after Diane's attack, we could have stopped him before his last attempt. I had thought his death would bring relief, but now I realized the burden would never truly be gone. That afternoon, I called Diane. It was time to tell David everything. She agreed. It was long overdue. That evening, I arrived at their house, and she ushered me into the living room before going to get David. I heard them approaching, David sounding annoyed at being interrupted from work. When he saw me, his irritation turned to confusion. "What's this about?" he asked. Diane sat beside him, her voice steady, but her eyes filled with tears. "I was attacked." David froze, struggling to process the words. His first thought was for her well-being, his second for their unborn child. But when she clarified that it had happened over 3 years ago and that Nathan was responsible, his composure cracked. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. But when he looked at me, his expression changed. "You knew?" I nodded. Diane quickly explained how I had found her afterward, how she had made me promise not to tell him. David clenched his jaw, struggling to contain his emotions. Then came the question I had never fully been able to answer myself. Why? Diane took a deep breath and began to explain. At the time, they had just graduated, full of dreams and plans for their future. She had convinced herself she could survive it alone, that telling David would only lead to violence, ruining everything they had built. She had chosen to protect him, no matter the cost. That was why she had enlisted me as her silent protector, why I had spent so many nights in their home when David was away. David's face darkened with realization. You were never going to tell me, were you? Diane lowered her gaze, unable to deny it. He looked over at me again, as if re-evaluating everything. Then, surprisingly, he exhaled and leaned back. At least now I understand why Ethan was always here. Diane and I exchanged stunned looks. You knew? She asked. He nodded. Their neighbor had once approached him, hinting that Diane might be having an affair with me, given how often I stayed over when he traveled. David had dismissed it without question. He knew me. More importantly, he knew Diane. But now, realizing the truth, he was left grappling with 3 years of deception. Why now? He finally asked. Nathan is dead. Why am I just hearing this? Diane couldn't answer. This was the part she couldn't handle. David's pain. So I spoke. Nathan had 5 victims, I said quietly, and he was planning a 6th. I watched Diane absorb this revelation, and in that moment, the weight of it all became too much. There was no undoing the past, no changing what had happened, but the truth was finally out. And for the first time in years, we were no longer living under its shadow. Diane hadn't seen Nathan's letter, and as she processed the information, I could tell she was wondering if there had been more victims. 5, I confirmed, all starting in freshman year. The weight of those words hung in the air. Diane's concern was obvious, especially when she asked if there was another victim after her, one we might have stopped. I didn't answer, knowing it wouldn't change anything. I handed the letter to David, who read it with Diane. They both silently absorbed the details, occasionally pointing things out to each other. After half an hour, David finally broke the silence, asking when I last spoke to Nathan. It had been a week before he died. David found it hard to believe that was all we talked about, especially since Nathan had died hours later. But I stood firm in my answer, insisting the letter contained everything important. There was no need for them to know more. I had already learned that Nathan's death was inevitable after finding out about Rachel, but some things were better left unsaid. Nathan's letter, though full of facts, names, dates, locations, never explained why he did what he did. The cold details offered no insight into his mindset. Evil doesn't always come with an explanation. Interestingly, after Diane, Nathan stopped his attacks for 3 years, only resuming a few months before his death. I'd unknowingly interrupted his next attempt, and that was the only comfort I could find. Diane's last question was the one that had been on her mind. She asked if I had liquidated Nathan, recalling the promise I'd made not to hurt him. I assured her I hadn't. She seemed relieved, though there was still concern for me in her eyes. David shared that concern too, but there was nothing more to say. Before I left, I reminded them about the funeral the next day. They agreed to attend. As I stepped out, David followed me and shook my hand with a firm grip. His eyes were filled with unsaid emotions, but we didn't need words. Driving away, I thought about Nathan's death. They say you enter and leave life alone, but I've always believed we leave with someone who truly loves us. Nathan had ended his own life, cutting his wrists in the bath. I'd kept my promise to be there, talking with him until the end. In that moment, he wasn't a monster. He was just the friend I had once known. 15 years later, Rachel and I walked into a restaurant, hand in hand, ready to celebrate our daughter Sophie's graduation from the University of Pennsylvania. She'd graduated summa cum laude, and her cousin Carlos, the baseball team captain, was in the same class. I felt emotional as I watched them, knowing how much this day meant. Inside, we joined family and friends. David and Diane were already talking to Miguel and Paula. We exchanged greetings before settling into the conversation. David was distracted, watching his daughter Clara and her cousin Carlos across the room, standing close and laughing with my sons. David looked at them and then at me, and I knew something had changed. I asked if Clara and Carlos were a couple now, and Rachel gave me a look that said I was missing something. Diane and Paula exchanged knowing glances and chuckled. David confirmed that they'd been dating for nearly a year. He also mentioned that they promised not to marry until Clara graduated, giving Carlos time to build his career. Diane joked that Clara probably wouldn't wait that long. I adjusted to the news. Sophie's accomplishments made me proud, but Clara's relationship made me realize how much had changed. Rachel smiled and said she'd explain it all to me later. Sophie and her boyfriend Peter arrived with her younger sister Olivia. Olivia, our surprise baby, was 3 now. She was the joy we never expected, born a decade after our 2 sons. Sophie was glowing with pride, and when she introduced Peter to the family, we all welcomed him warmly. Sophie had 2 godfathers, Miguel and David, and Peter was surprised. Sophie explained, smiling, that she was lucky to have them both.